Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of your favorite podcast, The Fantasy Birds, with my normal co-host, Mr. Tom Hickson. How are you doing today?
Doing pretty good. Life is good.
That's what I like to hear. So today we're getting into some buy low, sell high candidates in the fantasy basketball season, about 1/3 of the way through. So let's just update you on how we're feeling on some of these guys going forward and maybe influence a couple wins down the stretch for your teams. But let's start off with some buy low candidates. And we're going to start with Brandon Ingram at the top of the list, only averaging around 36 points per game in fantasy setting in a points league. And he's been under 30 points the last 4 or 5 games. It hasn't really been to his scoring outbursts, but he has hit under his scoring average, which is around 23 points per game in 3 of the last 4 games. So you do expect that to be a little bit better, but it's really coming from the assist and rebound numbers. Not really there. Probably something to do with the Pelicans struggling as of late. You got to expect this team's not going to perform it the way it has. The second to lowest team in the Western Conference as currently stand right now. So you got to expect that to come up a little bit. So Brandon Ingram, definitely a guy, even though preseason we didn't like him in the second round, we do like him going forward if you can get him at a little bit of a discount just because his numbers have been bad lately and there's no way they're going to continue to be that poor. So Brandon Ingram at the top of our list for our buy low candidate. Who sticks out to you here?
So the first name that I want to touch on real quick is De'Aaron Fox. Getting back to Brandon Ingram real quick, I will say that another thing to keep in mind if you're the Pelicans is there's going to be an opening in usage. Remember, the Pelicans are a team that's going to be looking to sell some of their players by the trade deadline. So guys like Lonzo Ball, JJ Redick, and Eric Bledsoe. Those are a few guys that are veteran players that are taking up some of the usage that are probably not going to figure into the team's long-term plans. So look for Brandon Ingram to soak up some of that usage as they go. I think De'Aaron Fox is an interesting buy low candidate. In that I do think there's some room for improvement there. But more importantly, I think his stats are a little bit misleading. When you go by his points per game in fantasy points league, he's currently averaging 34.6. However, that number is a little bit skewed. I'd say he's averaging more towards about 36 and a half, pushing 37, just because there are numerous games for De'Aaron Fox where there was a couple of weeks ago he had an injury. He did miss a couple of games, but then he came back, and for about 4 games or so he was on a minutes restriction. And a few of those games he had less than 20 fantasy points. Those are the types of outlier performances that are going to tank your average. But those don't really figure to look into his projection towards the end of the season. And I think I thought that De'Aaron Fox was going to be a guy that was poised for a breakout this year, and he has improved his numbers. But I think he's a guy that is going to increase his production as the season goes along. It's just my bold prediction.
Yeah, we like De'Aaron Fox in the preseason rankings at where he was drafted. A little underwhelming, but we expect that to get going. Likewise with John Wall, he's coming off an injury and really just starting to be the focal point of this team, him and now newly acquired Victor Oladipo. Only playing around 21 to 24 minutes in the last 2 games since coming back from the injury. We expect that to get up a little bit, especially with Victor Oladipo's injury history. John Wall is going to be the guy there to handle the ball at most times when he's fully ready to go. So only 33 and below 30 in the first 2 games back from injury. But with James Harden off the Rockets, John Wall looking to be a second-half league winner for some teams if you're able to get him cheap like he might be going for right now.
And yeah, so my next guy to look out for is Jimmy Butler. Jimmy Butler, as some of y'all who have owned Jimmy Butler might remember, you probably drafted him relatively high within the first 4 rounds, and at first he was not maintaining that production, mainly because I think through about 5 games or so he was only averaging maybe 13 points a game or something crazy like that, just because he had missed a lot of games. and he had a couple of outlier performances in the beginning of the season. And even now, you're seeing him being out for COVID-19 protocols. I think that's another reason to kick the tires on him. When you have a guy that hasn't played in a while, it's very easy. It's very easy to become complacent, and especially if a manager, if learn the managers in your league. If you have a guy that gets antsy, likes to make moves, doesn't like to have players on his bench sitting out for too long, eating up a hole in their roster, kick the tires on Jimmy Butler, because he's rebounded. He's rebounded quite nicely from his poor start. Now his average is up to 36 points a game, and that's even after missing the last handful of games with COVID protocols. You're going to see him come back soon. You're going to see him put up average 40 plus a night. I think if you want to get in on that, kind of like that GameStop stock right now, I think you need to get in on that real quick. So yeah, I think Jimmy Butler will be a really good contributor for you going along the season if you're able to scoop him up now.
Look, any chance we get to sneak in a little GameStop stock conversation, I'm all about it. Love that analogy.
It's a tongue twister too. I'm trying to say it, but it's impossible for me to say it right at full speed. You know what I mean?
Oh, I understand. And likewise, I like LaMelo Ball and Russell Westbrook, kind of for different reasons, but I like them definitely equally going forward. LaMelo Ball got off to a pretty good start for a rookie, rebounding, assisting, and scoring at a high clip. Lately it's been a little lower just because he's turning the ball over more, and the coaches decided to cut his minutes back to around 25 a game. And it's really hard to be productive in fantasy if you're only playing 25 a game. So I look for LaMelo Ball, his leash to come off just a little bit going down the line, because he's the third overall pick in the draft. He's going to have to get minutes for that Charlotte team, for that Michael Jordan-owned Charlotte Hornets team. So I do like LaMelo Ball's minutes to increase and his decision-making to be a little bit better coming down the line, maybe less turnovers. LaMelo Ball guy I'm definitely eyeing for a second half of the year run. And Russell Westbrook, look, he's coming off the quad injury where he only had to miss 2 games due to the COVID, since the Wizards didn't play for 2 weeks basically. But he's coming the first 2 games back, he's only putting up 26 and 36 fantasy points respectively. The minutes aren't high yet. Maybe a little bit of a limit coming off that injury, but still not playing back-to-back. So that, in addition to those numbers coming down, a 5-point drop in his average coming back from injury, those things lead me to believe Russell Westbrook, definitely a guy you should be buying low. Maybe not the guy you want to be the best player on your fantasy team, but definitely a second or third option. That will definitely be a huge contributor on a championship type team. So Russell Westbrook, definitely a guy, if you can get him cheap, somebody I'm looking to grab.
Yeah, I probably would too, given that he's missed some time. Speaking of missing time, Jaren Jackson Jr., I think is one of the most interesting names right now, in that I'm personally a subscriber of Jaren Jackson Jr. being a starting caliber player in your fantasy lineup when he comes back. He's a player that has shown a lot of potential, and I really feel like this year, he's coming in. He's coming in. He's coming in, and I think now, this being his 3rd season, this is an opportunity for him to really step up in his growth. However, he has missed the entire season up until this point, at recovering from a meniscus injury. And we're talking about buy low. Obviously, if you haven't played yet, you don't have any production to speak of. So it might be difficult. It might be difficult to value him, and it's all going to depend on what Jaren Jackson Jr.'s it's going to depend what the owner of Jaren Jackson Jr. thinks of what he's going to do when he comes back. But given he's a guy that hasn't really played yet, he's probably going to be a cherry on top of whatever lineup he's going to be in. The core guys in your lineup are probably set. So this is a guy that's not irreplaceable. He can be gotten for a decent price. And I think right now, if he does have that breakout, if he does end up having that breakout season, it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell because you can't really know in advance how someone's gonna come back from a knee injury. However, if he does have that breakout 3rd season down the stretch, I think now would be the time to get in on that, because he doesn't really have any production up until this point. and he's a really good basketball player, but he's got an interesting skill set, and like he blocks shots, he rebounds, but he also shoots a lot of threes. You figure he's gonna slide in as potentially the second option in that offense, but definitely gonna be a multi-category contributor. I think if you're gonna go for Jaren Jackson Jr., you should do it. You should do it now, and also I will say that he probably would have been back by now if Memphis hasn't missed almost 2 weeks because of their nightmare COVID protocol situation. Jackson, his most recent update says he's very close to making a return, and he probably would have made his return late last week had the Grizzlies actually been playing games. So I wouldn't worry about the injury going forward in terms of him missing games because of it. I think Jaren Jackson Jr. is a guy to get in on now and potentially reap the benefits late in the season.
Yeah, just to piggyback on Jaren Jackson Jr., I think it's important to note Brandon Clark, not listed on our sell high portion of the video, but definitely a guy you probably want to get rid of now before Jaren Jackson comes back and steals those minutes, steal those points and rebounds. So definitely getting rid of Brandon Clark early. Let's look at our last guy, Evan Fournier of the Orlando Magic. Coming back from injury, had a decent start to the year, got injured very early, and then Markelle Fultz went down. So he never actually played without Markelle Fultz yet, but Terrence Ross in that absence stepped up and was huge off the bench. You got to assume Evan Fournier picks up a little bit of the slack there, ball handling wise and scoring. And he's done that in his 4 games back. He's been over 18 points every single time, averaging around 22 actual points per game. And that's going to translate to about 30, 31 fantasy points. So just 4 or 5 points above what he was averaging pre-injury. So definitely Evan Fournier, a guy I'm targeting, not to make a huge difference in a fantasy season, but definitely a guy that can, fill a hole in your lineup. So Evan Fournier, a guy to look out for there. Now let's look into some sell high candidates we have for the rest of the season. And at number 1, it's your guy, Andre Drummond. What do you think about him?
Yeah, Andre Drummond was a guy that was producing elite numbers in the beginning of the fantasy season. He's one of the top players overall in fantasy, and usually should have been drafted around the second round of most fantasy basketball drafts. He's a stat hoarder. We all know that. However, the recent trade of Jared Allen has capped his minutes to a certain degree. Obviously, Cleveland has a lot of bigs in that rotation, so it's difficult. It's difficult to play Andre Drummond 34 plus minutes a night anymore when you have as many mouths to feed in that front court. His production on the surface since the trade, his production has taken a little bit of a hit, and that he has a couple of games that are subpar in terms of his standard, his average. I will say that one of those games where he only scored 17 fantasy points, he only played 18 minutes, and that game was a blowout from the start against Boston. So I do think he'll still be able to get you 40 plus per night, but the reason why I would sell high on Andre Drummond right now is because while he can still put up solid numbers for you, you're not really going to get the same upside that you had earlier in the season because of Jared Allen soaking up his minutes. Andre Drummond isn't going to get you the 60 point, 70 point nights that he was getting earlier in the season. So yeah, I would say that if you want someone with steady production who's pretty reliable every night to get you 40, Drummond is absolutely a guy to go after. But I don't think there are many 75-point games in his future.
Speaking of not many 75-point games in his future, I'm thinking Clint Capela coming off a very good week, probably the best week we've seen from Clint Capela in his entire career, if we're being totally honest. A triple-double with blocks, putting up massive numbers, averaging around 20 and 14 and however many blocks, considering that triple-double. Clint Capela, definitely a guy trying to move now while he's hot. He's averaging over 42 fantasy points per game, and that's even with his slow start to the year. Clint Capela, probably a guy you expect to average around 13 and 13 with a couple blocks. So the numbers lately, where it's been about 20 and 15, that's going to come down, no doubt about that. Clint Capela, if you can get a solid top option for him, I would definitely be on the move. Not saying, look, none of these guys on the sell high list we're definitely running away from and getting rid of at all costs. But Clint Capela, definitely a guy I would consider moving if another option was presented. Let's get into another guy, Jaylen Brown. Kind of the same story with Clint Capela, having a very good year, maybe arguably pick of the draft in some cases, going in the 4th or 5th round and putting up second-round numbers at the start. But, look, this could be due to the injury of Kemba Walker and Jason Tatum missing time. So you do expect those numbers to come down, but not too drastically, maybe 3 or 4 points off his total fantasy average at the end of the year. But Jaylen Brown, I'd sell him while he's hot before Jason Tatum, Kemba Walker come back and they hit their full stride, but not someone I'm totally avoiding at the end of the season. One more guy I want to talk about, Paul George. Look, we were off on him in the preseason rankings. He proved us wrong. He's been amazing so far, playing like playoff P. He forgot about how he played in the bubble. Thank goodness for that Clipper team. But, he's got the COVID issues. He's got to miss the next week or so. And look, I don't see his numbers staying put where it's at. I think it's definitely going to come down a wee bit. Paul George, with a week or two out because of COVID, also the numbers way too high for me right now. Paul George, a guy I'm probably looking to lean getting off my team if I can recoup some value for him. But those 3 guys, definitely some guys I'm consider trading while they're hot. What do you think?
Yeah, I think Jaylen Brown is a good one. I think Jaylen Brown, it's interesting because he's at that point. He's in his 4th season. It's about that time for him to kind of come into his own, right? To be that all-star level player. But if we know about how many, we know how many offensive weapons the Celtics have, especially on the perimeter. That's kind of where they get most of their scoring between him, Tatum, and Kemba Walker coming back. I do agree. I do agree with that, and that you could be potentially seeing a slight decrease in his scoring production, which lends itself to which would lend itself to a reduction in overall production. And so, like, that would be a good time to sell now that he's at his high. We think Jaylen Brown is at his highest value right now. And if you're going to trade him, now would be the time to do it for you to get the most value in return. Paul George is very inconsistent, and I don't really know what to make of him. But I think you could do well for yourself right now trading Paul George. So I would agree with that.
Yeah, let's talk about Enes Kanter for a second. Jusuf Nurkic out for an extended period of time with his injury. Enes Kanter has filled in nicely, grabbing over 20 rebounds in his previous performance. He's got his fantasy points per game average up to around 28, and considering it was, in the low 20s, teens to begin the season, Enes Kanter definitely a guy I'm looking to trade before Jusuf Nurkic comes back, because he's going to take his spot back in the starting lineup. He's a better player than Enes Kanter, even though Nurkic wasn't playing extremely well or anything, but definitely better than Enes Kanter. And some guy I'm looking to get rid of before his value completely drops off the face of the earth. So Enes Kanter, definitely a guy I'm looking to move on from.
Yeah, so the next guy that I want to talk about is Jerami Grant, who, by the way, is pretty much proven all of us wrong. I know in the beginning of the season we were very skeptical of Jerami Grant and whether him moving to a new team from Denver to Detroit was going to lend itself to consistent starting level production. And he's beyond just a capable starter. I mean, he's averaging damn near 40 points per game at 39.6. He's putting up solid numbers. And listen, he's been really good so far. I think the fact of the matter is that this is his first extended run as a featured player on a team where he's been putting up numbers like this. I think if Jerami Grant is going to be thrown around in trades, he's kind of ascended to the point where he's going to be thrown around. He's going to be mentioned in the same trades as, maybe he's thrown into a LeBron James centric trade, or something of that ilk, right? Kind of like he's putting up similar stuff to Christian Wood. Like, he's kind of in that same tier right now as a fantasy player. And so that's why I think, given his production, he's gonna be. He's like, hey, like, listen, I know I'm asking for LeBron here, but hey, look, Jerami Grant's averaging 40 points per game, right? Like, you can sell that. You can turn Jerami Grant into a more consistent, a more established asset. And I think if you're a good negotiator, I think that would be a good move to do. Look, Jerami Grant has been really good, but I'm not quite ready to say that Jerami Grant is going to be this all season and going forward. So look, if you can get a more consistent, established asset, maybe couple Jerami Grant with someone else to get a real top flight fantasy player, I say go for it, because whether he can keep putting up 40 points per night, we're not sure. I mean, he's the fourth ranked small forward right now. I mean, he's a top 5 player at his position. I don't know if that's going to continue. So if you can get a solid player, if you can get a reliable blue chip fantasy player in return, I think you got to go for it.
Yeah.
And then,
the last guy we
sorry.
want to talk about is Collin Sexton of the Cleveland Cavaliers, coming back, having an amazing game against the Brooklyn Nets. But let's not forget about his buddy Darius Garland, who's also coming back. So maybe his value tanks a little bit. We're not saying Collin Sexton, like, none of these guys are completely awful players in the rest of the season, but definitely a little bit hitting the value, I would say, about Collin Sexton there with the Garland emergence coming back from injury. So anything else you want to say about Collin Sexton?
Yeah. So like you said, I think it's a good point about Darius Garland coming back. Collin Sexton obviously was in the news just because he had 2 really good games against Brooklyn. Brooklyn having Kyrie Irving at point guard, who is not a good defensive point guard. So he has 2 big games. He has 2 big games with something to prove against Brooklyn. And obviously that'll put him on SportsCenter. That'll put him on front page of ESPN. He's gotten a lot of attention for that. And at first you would look at that and you would think, okay, well, this guy is starting to ascend, right? He's starting to go towards the next level. Well, he's already shown ever since those 2 games against Brooklyn, that was more of an aberration than anything else. Look, his next 3 games, obviously the game against Boston, he only played 16 minutes. He got 8 points, just like I did with Drummond in that Boston game for Cleveland. I'm going to throw that out. I think that's more of an outlier. I think more of the reliable production that you're going to get from him comes from his next 2 games, in which he had 27 and 28 points. I think those are 2 reasonable expectations that you can have. He can get you around 30 a night. He's been he's currently averaging 35 or 34.4 for the season. So he's exceeding that a little bit. But I think that Collin Sexton, because of those 2 games, I think his profile has emerged, and I think it's emerged to the point where you want the next young thing, and I think a lot of people would be willing to trade for him and give up something decent for him because they want him in their lineup. And I think if someone wants to give you some good package for Collin Sexton, I think you go for it, because unless he keeps putting up those 64, 44 point games, I think this is a player you got to sell on, because I don't think he's going to be doing that every night in the future for the rest of the season.
No doubt about that. We agree there. Look, that's going to wrap it up for the Fantasy Birds with the buy low and sell high portion of the video. We thank you guys for watching. We'll see you next time with the Fantasy Birds.